O rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet. Because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? This is the word of the Lord. Amen. Did you ever get into an argument with God? Did you ever question God? Did you ever challenge God? We find some incidences in the Bible where believers did question God. I do not recommend it, but it happens sometimes when people are going through times of trauma. Job questioned God's love as his world fell apart, as you know, and everything near and dear to him seemed to disappear until finally his health broke. His family was killed. His wife told him to curse God. His possessions were destroyed by natural disasters. And his friends turned against him and accused him of being evil. And so he despaired of life and argued with God. Jonah questioned God's justice. Jonah was sent to preach to this pagan city and offer them salvation. And Jonah looked upon these people as enemies of Israel and did not want to go. And then, when God took away one of the comforts that he had, something that was sheltering him from his own misery, he complained to God. Habakkuk had problems with the world that he saw. And so he seems to be questioning God's providence. In the 3rd verse of the 1st chapter, he says, "Why do you show me iniquity?" In the 13th verse, he says, "Why do you look on those who deal treacherously?" In verse 14, he says, "Why do you make men like fish of the sea?" He could not understand what God was up to. Things didn't make sense to him. On the one hand, he knew God to be this way, and yet his ways in the world seemed to contradict it. A few years ago, I remember hearing on the radio a song entitled, "If I Rule the World." I don't know if you ever heard that or not. And in that song, the singer spoke of how much better he could do in governing the universe than God. He would do this, he would do that. I suppose we all do have questions. And maybe that's good that we have a book like Habakkuk that verbalizes some of the problems we have as we look at God's governance. We know God is sovereign. We know He's in control. And as one of the presidents who said as he was visiting in Thailand this week, the former president, President Clinton, I believe, said, "We know that we're not in control, but we have to be taught it sometimes by disasters like this." Well, let's look at the problem of God's providence, and then we'll look at the solution. I only have 2 points today to my message. Usually I have 3 or 4. You're getting a break. But don't get presumptuous. There are some subpoints. There are 3 problems that I see here in this book of Habakkuk right off the bat. And the first one is, why does God send trouble? Why does God send trouble into our lives? We can go through the Bible and give you text after text that says that these things are somehow under the providence of God. If God's a loving God, we know He's loving, and we know also that He's omnipotent. He has power over everything. There's nothing that's outside the realm of His power, right? Now, I know there may be a few people who are humanistic and say God has no control, but most of us don't believe that. I'll prove that you believe God is omnipotent. That means all-powerful. Did you ever pray God will give you a safe trip? Did you ever pray as you got into an automobile to take a long trip, Lord, give us safety? That implies you believe He's omnipotent. That implies He's in control of the weather. He's in control of the drunk driver that might be driving down the highway. You believe in the omnipotence of God. And yet God is also a loving God. And so, Habakkuk looks at all the iniquity, and he says, why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. Verse 3. He looks at all this violence. He looks at all this trouble. And he says, I don't understand this, Lord. It doesn't make sense to me. Why don't you do something? Why don't you stop this evil? Problem, right? Right? Yeah, problem. Second problem I see here is, why does God allow the wicked to prosper? Things seem out of joint sometimes. In verse 13, he says, you are of purer eyes than to behold iniquity. And by the way, this is one of the great verses on the holiness of God. We've done studies here from time to time on the attributes of God. And the attributes of God means the qualities of God. And as we look into the Word, we find out what kind of a God He is. You know, I can look out here and look at the natural world, the beautiful sky, the moon, the stars, the earth with all of its intricate balances of nature, the flowers, the trees. I can see God has power. But I look into the Bible and I find out His moral character, and I find out He's holy. He hates sin. And Habakkuk says, you're of pure eyes to behold iniquity. You cannot look on wickedness. God hates iniquity. God hates wickedness. But the question is, if He hates wickedness, why does He allow the wicked to prosper? Why is it that the people who blaspheme God, who despise the Lord, who are maybe atheists, why doesn't He judge them? I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Robert Ingersoll. He was a famous agnostic who lived in the 19th century, and he went up and down the country lecturing against Christianity and against God. And he said, there cannot be a God, for look at all the evil there is in the world. And he made a demonstration one day to a great crowd of people. He said, I'm going to prove there is no God. Now, the Bible teaches that God will destroy evil people. That when you curse God, He'll kill you. I read that in the Bible. Now, I'm going to prove there's no God. And so he got his stopwatch out. Here was a huge crowd of people listening to him. And he said, I'm going to blaspheme God worse than any you have ever heard. I'm going to curse God, and if there's a God, He's going to kill me in 5 minutes. And so he let out a terrible oath. He made the air blue with his profanity. And he said, I'm giving God, now God, if you're there, kill me in 5 minutes. Poop. And he hit the stop. 4 minutes. Tick, tick, tick. 3 minutes. Go ahead, kill me, God, if you're there. 2 minutes. 1 minute. 59 seconds. 58 seconds. The people began, one woman fainted. Sweat popped out on their face. It came to 0 minutes. Nothing happened. I told you there was no God. Reverend Joseph Parker, the great Methodist preacher of London, England, heard about this. And someone asked him about it. Why did God not kill him after he blasphemed His name? And Parker said, did the gentleman from America think he could exhaust God's patience in 5 minutes? God is so patient. God puts up with so much So Habakkuk says, I don't understand, Lord, why you're a holy God and you allow the wicked to prosper. You look out here and you see people that hate God, they don't go to church, and they're just doing great. They have all this money, they build these big houses, but they don't go to church. They drive these big cars, and here you are going around in a jalopy. Well, actually, I don't know many of you people that drive jalopies, but I'll tell you what I did see in the Ukraine. When you're over there in parts of the old Soviet Union, at least it was true several years ago that the mafia seemed to be in control of everything. The education system, the businesses, the government, and everything. And the cops don't get any money for, at least that time, they weren't being paid a salary, so they got their money by stopping people and fining them. And so you'd see these poor little guys driving around the little old rusty cars and, trying to keep them going. They'd pull them over and try to fix the engine and so forth. And you go about 5 miles, here comes the cop, and the preachers are all poor. Every time we went to an airport, we had to stop and pay the cop. But then you look at this great big BMW ripping down the road about 100 miles an hour, no problem. Why? The mafia. Why does God allow all this injustice in the world if He's holy? Thirdly, why does God allow such disorder in the world? Verse 14. Why do you make men like fish of the sea? God says He's raising up the Chaldeans, verse 6. Look in verse 6. For I indeed, God says, am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth. Now God says He's raising up, get this, God says He's raising up an evil nation against His own people, Israel. And Habakkuk was an Israelite. He was a Jew. He loved his nation. He was patriotic. And yet God says, I'm getting ready to send an evil nation against you. And He says, why, God? Why do you make men like fish of the sea? Many of the good people that I know are just like fish. They're so helpless. They can't do anything. They're swimming around and cruel people come along and they throw their hooks in or they throw their nets in and they gather them in. They just trample them under their feet. The good people are at the bottom. The evil people are on top. God, why? And so the problem is accentuated very clearly here. Violent and ruthless Babylonians are about to persecute, to destroy God's own nation. And Habakkuk just doesn't understand. He's baffled. Now, this brings us to point number 2, and that is the solution. Let me just say this, that as we read the Word, and we find these problems cropping up, and as they crop up in our own lives, and we go through this, we ask these questions sometimes. We've got to remember that God does not always give us a clear answer very soon. In fact, sometimes God doesn't even answer the question at all, really. In fact, when Job gets through all of his complaining and murmuring against God, and he's commended, by the way, in the New Testament for his patience, but actually, if you read the book of Job itself, he gets pretty put out at God. And he wants God to take his life. He's tired of what's going on. But in the end of the book of Job, God doesn't really give him an answer. He just shows up in His glory and says, Job, you're asking too many questions. Who were you to question me? Just be patient. Where were you when the morning stars sang together? Did you make Orion and the Pleiades? Look up at these stars. Did you make all that? I'm in control, and I know what I'm doing. And so let me say that sometimes we just have to rest ourselves in the character of God without getting an immediate answer. But there are some things we need to understand. First of all, we need to take refuge in the character of God. Do you remember when God came to Abraham and said He was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sin? Abraham had some relatives in town, and he was regretful that God had made this threat. And so he goes to God and he pleads for the people. He intercedes. And finally he makes kind of a bargain with God, and Abraham said, Lord, if there are like 40 or 50 people in town, will you spare it? Yes, God said, I will. 25? Yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers, but you see the idea. Yes, I'll spare it if there are just a few. It comes down to just a handful. And God says, yes, if even there are only 5 or 10 in this town, I will spare the city. But in the meanwhile, Job pleads with God like this, God, will you not do right? In other words, Job trusts God to do right. Though he does not always understand what God's up to. And so let me say this to you today, my friend. Everything God says is true, and everything God does is right, whether we understand it or not. We don't judge the Bible. We don't judge God. God judges us. Some people come and read the Bible to judge the Bible. And they get their microscopic critical eyes out and they try to examine the Bible and they find mistakes in the Bible. I don't read the Bible to find mistakes. I let the Bible speak to my mistakes. I let the Bible judge me. So we have to take refuge in the character of God, and what we do find in this book of Habakkuk is some tremendous reminders of the kind of God that we serve, which we call the attributes of God. And one of them is His eternality, as we see in verse 12, are you not from everlasting? God always was. God always will be. He had no beginning. He's the uncaused cause. He's the source of everything. And sometimes we just have to get lost in the contemplation of what an awesome God we serve. We just have to bow on our knees and look up and say, God, you're eternal. I'm temporary. You're the creator. I'm the creature. And we can worship a God like that. We've already mentioned God's holiness, as seen down in verse 13. He cannot look at wickedness. Also, over in chapter 2, verse 20, there's a tremendous verse. Let's look at that. Chapter 2, verse 20, the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. I used to go to the Pollard Baptist Church in Ashland, Kentucky, where I was saved and baptized. And the choir director used to get up sometimes at the beginning of the service and lead us in a benediction. The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. And we just sit there and just in reverence and in silence. I think there's a time we can make some noise in church, praise the Lord with all kinds of instruments, but also there's a time when we just need to be quiet. Be silent before the Lord. How long has it been since you were silent or just quiet before the Lord? You know, when we go out today somewhere, when by ourselves, we have to have radios and these doggone cell phones. You know, you people going down the road, you know, you can't see anybody just driving along. You know, they're talking, and the kids out in the mall, you know, and got to have noise, got to have somebody talking to all the time. How about just sometime don't take the cell phone, don't take a radio, just be quiet, silent. The psalmist said, for us to be still and know that God is God. Go up into the mountain. Go out somewhere in a field. Get alone. Chapter 2, verse 20. The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. God is in His holy temple. That means He is exalted. He is on the throne of heaven. And then chapter 3, verses 6 through 10, He talks about God's power. I'm telling you, to contemplate who God is will help you to deal with the difficulties of life. Even though you don't understand, just knowing God is itself a blessing. Chapter 3, verse 6, He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains scattered. Their perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. It goes on to describe how the mountains tremble before God and the deep utters its voice. These are poetic ways of expressing God's majesty and His creation's dependence on Him. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. This is all poetic language, I know, verse 11. Do you see the glory of God in nature? The prophets of God in the Scriptures saw the glory of God in nature. David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork." You know, I can go out in the springtime, and when the soft sun is shining down on the grass, and I see the flowers bloom, I think of the love of God. I think of the mercy of God. But you know, I live up on a hill, and sometimes will see a storm coming out of the west. And I see the clouds rolling, and I see the lightning flash, and I hear the thunder, and I'm reminded of the power of God. Yes, I tell you, knowing God is in control, though you don't understand His ways, can comfort your heart. But secondly, as we think about the solution, we have to see that Habakkuk clings to God in simple faith. Habakkuk clings to God. And, oh, brother and sister, let me talk to you about this from my heart this morning. Faith, someone says, is just clinging to God, forsaking all. I trust Him. A-F-A-I-T-H. Forsaking all, I trust Him. Cling to God when you don't understand. Cling to God when His ways are mysterious. And it's in chapter 2 that this verse crops up. Here it says in verse 4, "The proud, his soul is not upright in him." In other words, the proud person is not righteous, is not trusting in God, but the just shall live by his faith. Brothers and sisters, faith is something that saves us, but we live by it also. When you were saved, when you became a Christian, you trusted Jesus as your Savior. You didn't understand everything. You didn't know all the theology. You couldn't recite the creed. You didn't understand the hymns, but you just trusted Jesus. But you know, we have to trust Him every day. You not only are saved by faith, you have to live by faith. You have to walk by faith. And here's one thing faith means. It means hanging on to God even when the storm is blowing, even when you don't understand, even when His way is mysterious, you trust Him. What else can you do? What else can you do? You go to the doctor and you've gone through a test. And the doctor comes in, he's got a long face. And he gives you some bad news. What do you do? One day you're sitting in your room and your spouse walks in and says, "I'm leaving. I'm leaving." What do? Dad and Mom are at home watching television, hearing about the war in Iraq. How the body bags are coming back. And one day they get a ring at the door, and here's a man in a military uniform. With a somber but compassionate face, he says, "Your son was killed in action." My son. What did he do wrong? He didn't hurt anybody. He was a patriot. What do? The initial reaction, shake your fist at God. God, this can't be. One of my best friends, one of my mentors in the ministry, had a young son. He was a football player, played halfback for our high school team. Bright young man, good kid. Just before the Vietnam War was over, he was sent to Vietnam. Just a few days before they began to pull American troops out, he was walking along, hit a landmine, blew him into eternity. Why? In such times as this, my friend, divorce, poverty, you lose your job, your husband or wife are unfaithful or leave you? Why? That's where faith comes in. And I want you to know that this statement of Habakkuk got the attention of the New Testament writers. It's quoted by Paul in chapter 2 of Romans, verse 4, the just shall live by faith. In chapter 1 of Romans, verse 17. It's cited also in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. The just shall live by his faith. Now you have a choice today. You can trust God in the storm, or you can get angry and become an atheist or a skeptic. And I honestly believe that your religion will be tested in a time of trouble, and it will be tested. And then you will know if you have real faith. If you're a fair weather follower of Jesus, or if you can follow Jesus in the valley, then you'll know if you have real faith in Jesus. Which brings us now to the third point, and that is Habakkuk resolves to be faithful regardless of what happens. We're talking about how he deals with his problem. I want you to look at this. This is absolutely amazing. Chapter 3. Verse 17. This is how Habakkuk ends his little book. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there are no herds in the stall, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk lived in an agricultural community. A man's wealth and prosperity was determined by such things as the prosperity of his fields, his flocks, his olive trees. These were where life was at. This was what made you prosperous or happy or successful. Now, many people would say, I'll serve you, God, as long as my olive trees are bearing. I'll serve you as long as I have lots of camels or lots of cattle or lots of sheep. I'll serve you, Lord, as long as my crops are successful, as long as my corn is plentiful. But Habakkuk, and we've already seen that he said he would trust God no matter what the circumstances. Now he says, although all these things that are precious to me collapse and fall apart, even if my fields don't yield their crops, even if my olive trees fail, even if my flocks are cut off, and there's no herd in the stall, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. In other words, Habakkuk is saying, God, I'm going to love you for who you are, not just because of your blessings. I like your blessings. I like health. I like prosperity. I like riches. I like fields. But I'll rejoice in you, Lord, even if you take this away. There is a man of faith. There is what a believer is. This gives a lie to the corrupt theology that many teach today, that Jesus is a meal ticket to greatness and power and health. Well, he can be, and he often is, but to follow Jesus may mean to walk in the valley of the shadow of death. Can you rejoice in the Lord if he takes your blessings away? Can you love God if he takes your wife away? Can you love God if your spouse leaves you? Can you love God if you lose your job? Can you love God if the doctor gives you the bad news? God has a greater plan for you. God has victory for you out there somewhere. God can turn things around like he did Job. But in the meantime, the solution is to serve God no matter what. Not as a bargain, but just simply because He's worthy. Do you see what I'm talking about? God deserves our worship. God deserves our praise. Whether we're up or down, whether we're sick or well. And so that really is the solution. Taking refuge in the character of God, clinging to God in simple faith, and resolving to be faithful regardless of what happens. Can we trust God when things are going bad? We leave our lives in the hands of the Lord even if He does strange things. Even if the world seems out of order, can we say, God, we know You're eternal, we know You're holy, we know You're powerful. We just leave it with You. That's what faith is. So I'm going to ask you today to just trust your Lord. Put your faith in Him. Trust Him. He'll help you.